This year, the Spider Forest Comic Collective is bringing you tales from beyond the confines of time itself in Threads Immortal. 16 brand new standalone short comics examining the eternal, the undying, and the unkillable, either by living forever or defying the Reaper. Or short comics are immortal. Check out Threads Immortal on Kickstarter right now. The project is running until the 22nd of May.
Hello, and welcome to Screen Tones, where we talk anything and everything webcomics. Today, we're going to be talking about RP and webcomics and their connections. I'm Verathane, my pronouns are she, they, and I make the webcomics Chiralt and Witchwood.
Hi, I'm Finn. My pronouns are they, them, and I make the webcomic Heirs of the Veil.
Hi, I'm Ray, and my pronouns are they, them, and I make the webcomics On Empyrean High and Overlord of Ravenfell.
Yeah, and I think all three of us, to some extent, have experience with freeform roleplay. Roleplay has been with us since the dawn of the internet, and many of us have created original characters in RPs on forum boards or chats that later found their way into our comic work. It can be a really great way to get the ball rolling on coming up with us with a story collaboratively, which can obviously connect directly to webcomics. And today we're going to talk about our own experiences with it. So I'll get started with the first question, which is just generally what parts of your work have been influenced by RP?
Yeah, oh gosh. So basically, I think at the moment, right now, in my work, a lot, because a lot of the things that story wise happen in the comics, that when it comes to like character relationships, a lot of that has been established through RPs. And I think I've been like doing RPs for pretty long time. I think I started to RP with my husband in like 2008. So there's like, I don't know, about 15 years of baggage. But even before we actually started to RP together and to put these things into stories, I got like a recommendation from an acquainted comic artist who was like, yeah, if you ever get stuck in like your stories, get yourself like someone you trust and just play out the scene with the characters to basically get loose and maybe get new ideas. So before I even knew what RP actually was, I was kind of already using it for my work when I got to like scenes that were hard or character relationships that I couldn't figure out, because it can help a lot to basically just, because it's kind of like a form of like free form writing where you basically don't think a lot in the moment depending on the RP style. You basically have a little like, I don't know, kind of like this, it can be kind of this like rapid fire exchange where you get into a role basically and play that out with someone else, and that can actually like be really cool to just, I don't know, just let your thoughts flow and not be as restricted as you would be by just trying to plot everything like the conventional way. I think I also like use RP a lot to try out story ideas or plot ideas, mostly for one of my work in progress projects, where every time I change the plot a little bit, I go to my RP partner and ask her to like try it out with me to see what works and what doesn't work. And the things that work, that get basically written down and in some way adapted into the comic, and everything that doesn't work like gets thrown out, or maybe I'll think about it for later. So I think RP is basically a little bit like, at least with trying to figure out the characters and the stories in itself, it's like a pretty
There's
strong
definitely a
basis
lot to be said
for
for the
the
freedom
comics
of
that
kind of
I
exploring
make.
things that way, where you're really kind of thinking from the inside out, from the perspective of the characters, and there's not really like expectations or pressure of putting it together. Like you're just kind of having fun with it. It can be very freeing in that regard. Uh, but how about you, Ray?
Well, for me, I've pretty much been role playing since I was like probably 11 on like Dragonlance roleplay forums and chats and stuff. So, pretty much since I started comics, a lot of my influence actually came from role play, because a lot of people are like, "Hey, you should draw comics of our characters and put me in there," and stuff like that. And so pretty much ever since I've drawn comics was pretty much since kind of like the push and pull is when has been influenced by RP. And I find a lot of the exploration and characterization, a lot of the settings that I've never done before. I've just been like, oh, hey, this is cool. Let's toss in this in and see what happens. Is pretty much a lot of it has been RP, and it's been pretty interesting because, it's just all this back and forth, a lot of surprises, things that you've probably never thought of doing on your own because you have this partner that isn't you. So you're like, oh, I would have never thought of that on my own. So, and I originally started out in like a group chats and stuff. So it was like a lot of people, but it's like one person that I've pretty much work with exclusively, because group fallouts and stuff do not make good comics, and they end up being my writing advice person to go to. But yeah, it's pretty much I go to it mostly for characterization nowadays. Character settings tend to be mostly something that I come up on my own now, though. But originally it was pretty much exploration and new ideas, working as a collaboration type work that was the main thing for me.
Yeah, that collaborative aspect and like other people throwing in stuff that is different from what you might have done if you'd been solo can be like so invigorating about it. Cause like, I mean, we all got into this because we like storytelling on some level. And I guess in RP, sometimes you really truly are kind of also hearing the story from another individual, which has its own kind of joy. I actually, Terralt got started in part from sort of a variant role play type, I guess. So back in like 2006, I used to hang out on this type of board called a paint chat, where you have it was like a branch of Oikaki, which is like a browser based painting
Oh, I
software.
remember those.
And there were all these paint chats that used to be around. There was one called Nico's that was pretty big, but some people could just set it up on their own server for fun. And a user on a webcomic forum that I was a member of had their own. Actually, no, it wasn't even that one. Anyway, someone had their own paint chat that they had just installed on their server for fun to invite a handful of friends to. And I joined it and was doodling around. And I doodled this character, and a whole bunch of other people started doodling around him, showing like their characters interacting or poking him or like drawing bugs around him and stuff like that. And as they did this, I would like erase out bits of the face and change the expression and add like a little speech bubble. And then they would add a speech bubble, and we would like talk to each other that way. And it was not necessarily the first time I'd ever seen RP online, but it was kind of the first time I'd seen anything like I'd been in it, like in the middle of it like that. And the next day when I rejoined the paint chat, I drew the same character again, but like in a different pose. And then people would draw in different things, and we would kind of all have like this little rotating cast of characters. And the doodle that I had done was just I thought it was going to be a one-off of this character with like fun horns and like sort of dreadlocks hair, or no, it was a hood at the time and like a scarf. But the more I drew this character and the more other people drew around him, the more I was like, wow, like I'm getting like a feel of the personality of this person. Like seems like kind of a lot of fun to like just kind of poke him. And I ended up merging it together with this plot premise that I'd been turning over at the back of my head, completely separate. I was like, but like, I kind of want to do something with this guy because like I have this feel for him as a person now, and I'd love to like make him a part of an actual story. And I sort of smushed them together. And one of the other people on that, like that character was Kieran, who became the protagonist of Geralt. And actually, one of the other Paint Chat users came up with Tico. So I got permission before going in and like starting the webcomic. But that's actually the deep lore origin story of how how Geralt got started. Anyway, I'm going to go on to the next question, which is how is developing a character in an RP setting different than writing one outside of that setting? What does the process look like, and how did that work its way into your comics?
So I would say that it's a little bit more chaotic and that it can be difficult when you develop a character just in RP to translate all the context, especially when it's like from long form RP from a long RP that might span like months or in some cases even years to like translate all that context then into the comic because you kind of at some point already have like this fully fleshed out character, but how do you like explain to the readership who this character is or what's going on? So sometimes when you adapt characters like that and you do not change a lot from one medium to the other, it can sometimes feel a little bit jarring. Like there's already context that the readers should be aware of about that character that might be difficult to establish in the comic itself. So that's why, for me, when I actually develop characters in RPs, I kinda try to like look at what I do in the RPs as kind of like more of an alternate universe, and then I take the traits and what I like about the character, and once they are supposed to like go into comic form, I try to like rearrange them a little bit. So they're basically still the same character, but I'm kind of rebuilding them without like the baggage from the RPs, because in most cases, most RPs that I did, I was never like active in groups or did group RPs because I was too like socially awkward. So I only ever did like one-on-one RPs with very close friends. That's why most of the RPs that I had were like long, and every character that was like developed in such an RP had like this like these really long-winded backstories that developed during the RP process. Like I remember like Cortes, one of the protagonists from Heirs of the Veil, went through like I think 1,000 iterations. At some point he was like part lizard god, and that's all like
Oh,
basically yeah through like weird RPs. So when I started to do Straya, like the predecessor of Heirs of the Veil, where that was basically still a part of his backstory, I kind of, when I went to Heirs of the Veil to reboot the comic, I kind of was like, okay, what are the things that I like from these RPs that I should throw out because it makes the story less cohesive if it's all there. And that's actually like a process that takes a little bit of work to actually, because you already know who the character is, you know everything about that character because you like played this character's story, this character's life so much. But at some point, like, you have to sit down and figure out what is important for the readers, what is important for the story that you want to tell, and what are the things that will be left out because they're kind of too wild or don't really make sense in basically a comic format. Because yeah, RPs can be really long-winded, so it like kind of makes it kind of difficult to go about having like long-winded stories and long-winded characters in a format that will probably not span like 20 to 50 books.
yeah, that part can definitely be tricky. And adapting things from prose to where you can really literally get into the character's head and have whole like paragraphs about like their inner thoughts and like what they're feeling in the moment, and then turning that into visual. Unless you do the manga route of having like a million thought bubbles of them hyper analyzing everything, it can be tricky. to be like, what are they smelling in this moment? And maybe that's a huge thing during the prose version, but you can't really, it's difficult to illustrate. How about you, Ray?
I do think viewing it as a alternate universe is definitely a good route to go, because you definitely are going to have to do some sort of editing to get that into essentially what's an adaptation of your role playing, because it's going to be a different format, is essentially what it is. Like, it's just like going from prose to comic, is you're going to have to make some changes because it's a different medium. So it's just going to have to change because it's different. And I will say, when you're taking it from RP sessions, you're also going to have to consider that it's going to take a lot longer that to turn this into a comic. So you're going to have to consider that is this person going to be my friend in 10 years for me to finish this thing? Because my first webcomic, that did not happen. And that certainly is a blow to motivation when you're making a webcomic, is if you have a huge falling out with your friends and half the characters are theirs, well, it's going to get a lot harder to write your roleplay comic if you don't like the person that half the characters are based off of anymore. Even if you like the characters themselves, it definitely can get a lot harder to write those characters.
Yeah, the webcomic that was the first comic I ever read, that the first webcomic that introduced me to the scene, it started that way. It was literally the creators were a couple
Oh yeah.
initially, and they had been role playing their characters with each other, and they broke up, and that was the end of the comic. In some ways, I was talking during the first question about Teralt and how a form of RP was kind of partly responsible for starting it, but I feel in some ways kind of lucky that it wasn't really a story, or it didn't really go further than that. It was like the seed of the character that I took and could kind of do my own thing with. And I was completely free to like come up with my own story direction. It was not a collaborative effort other than that like very initial like spark of an idea. And so to some extent I'm glad that I had that freedom. Although sometimes I do look at other comics that are collaborative efforts and I'm like, it'd be nice to have help from someone, but it's never that simple. And I have done freeform text RPs with friends in stories. And I have some characters from those that I really love. And like the storylines were a ton of fun. In some cases, we have storylines that actually finished. Like it became a completed narrative in a sense, albeit a really long and rambling one. And sometimes I kind of wish like it would be neat if we could get a comic of that off the ground, but it can be tough if like the two creators are operate at different speeds or aren't quite like in sync or in agreement about what direction that's going to go in. So I'm not sure whether those will happen, but it would be cool someday.
I think the point about creators working in different speeds, or creators maybe not being able, while the ideas and the bouncing off of each other might work in something like freeform RP, might not be like translatable to an actual comic, and the energy that you have during those RPs like might not be something that translates into working in a different medium. I kind of like the experiences I have is that you often have like one person who's can be kind of the main idea guy and then like takes a lot of the things and does a lot of stuff with that. And especially when you adapt something like an RP, figuring out who takes what role and who is basically with a comic doing most of the work and actually drawing that comic can be kind of difficult, and something that I ran into recently after basically I was writing Heirs of the Whale with my husband, and he like dropped from the project, not because like something terrible happened, but he didn't feel the project as much anymore and he had a lot of things going on in his life. But I kind of noticed that the characters that we like developed in those RPs, especially his characters, I didn't have that strong connection to them. So I'm right now in the process of building like a connection to these characters, making them kind of mine, so I can write them adequately and like give them a satisfying story.
Yeah, having the same energies if you are collaborating is definitely important. For my first webcomic, which, as I said, did have end up having a falling out, we did try having a collaboration at first where I was the main idea person as well as drawing it. Some of my other role play partners did offer to do the writing and the coloring and the inking at first, but they never actually would ever meet the deadlines, and I would end up having to do it myself in the end, and it ended up being very frustrating, and I would end up having to do all of it. And to be honest, it was like a three times a week comic, so it was like not exactly very healthy schedule in the first place, but it was it was very frustrating though to end up having all of that expectation and having to do it all on your own in the first place. So it's one of those, do you do it all on your own? Do you try to collaborate? Do you just be like, "Hey, can I use your characters and I'm just going to draw it?" Or and consult you on if they're in character in the first place, or what? You just need to have the expectations before you get started. I do suggest maybe starting a scene and going from there if you're trying to collaborate, though, because you don't want this happening at launch.
Yeah, I personally think it's also very important to very early on, when you basically decide to turn this RP into more and like be it a comic, be it like a novel or some other kind of project, to basically set your expectations, the expectations of your collaborator, and know where you both stand. Because I remember like I knew someone once, they also like worked on a comic project and kinda ran into the problem that a character that had kinda like gotten pretty popular within that comic could not really be used, could not really be expanded about, because it was a character from a friend of theirs that they RP'd with, that they like used for the comic at some points, mostly I think like as this kind of like Easter egg character between themselves. But he kind of got like really popular and they ended up like having to drop some of the storylines that the character was involved with, because their friend wanted to use their character for their own story. So they basically had like loose ends with this like kind of popular character that they had in that comic that like never got expanded on, because the other collaborator wanted to use the character for an own project, which I do not think like ever came to be. But that's also something, especially like if you use other people's characters from those RPs, like you have to right from the start know, what can I do with this character, how much can that character actually be involved in the story, or does the other person want to do something with that character later on. So maybe it would be better to like have the character not be there.
Yeah, that's that'd be a pretty important thing to iron out, which kind of leads into the third question, which is, what is your advice to someone looking to take their RP sessions, settings, their characters or their friends' characters, and turn them into a long form narrative like a webcomic?
Yeah, so I think we already mentioned a few things that might go awry if you like try to adapt the webcomic. I think for me, it would be that if you want to adapt like RP into a comic or a web comic, take some time, figure it out, try to maybe like for the fun of it work with your collaborator, see what the roles are, how the other person works, how you actually work together when you work on something that's not freeform RP, and to right in the beginning like maybe try to already set a list of the things that cannot make it into the comic because they might be too difficult. Because I think especially with RP comics, especially with like very long form RPs, there is like this, you might be tempted to be like, okay, I'm gonna make this like huge epic story with all these characters and all like their interactions and entanglements. And I think if you like try to adapt the RP, it would be important to give it like a good structure and see basically what you can actually take into it, because comics are like such a time intensive form of labor, and it takes so long to actually get through the story, to actually draw the comic. So keeping it a little bit shorter is probably like beneficial unless you have like a lot of time to work on it. So for me, I would say give it like format the thing, try to like streamline it, and try to be on the same page with your collaborator and know exactly where each of you stands. And even then there might be problems in the future, so adapting RPs can be a little bit difficult unless it's really someone you know 100% you can trust and you have been friends for 15 years, and you will probably be friends for 15 years more. I guess that would be like an extreme case, but it's like a lot to think about if it's actually worth it to adapt the thing in the end.
Yeah, in some cases, like it could be such a blast just writing the thing out. But part of the advantage of RPs is that freeform nature and how you're just kind of having fun exploring and wandering around and not necessarily thinking about optimal story structure or trying to be concise for a graphic novel adaptation. What do you think, Ray?
I would say don't be afraid to go off script to edit, or honestly just go off the rails completely when it comes to using the narrative of RPs, and just use the characterization as a base. Because what makes an interesting RP and what makes an interesting comic story can be completely different things, especially since RPs can tend toward what would be considered melodrama for comics. So I would honestly personally just use the characterization for a base, because especially since my role plays end up to be kind of meandering in story, and a lot of my characters tend to get tossed in and no focus point tends to happen. Where for comics, I think what is really beneficial is when you tend to have just a couple characters in focus, and most of the other characters tend to be background or supporting characters. And one of the main drawbacks for RP stories tend to be character bloat, and you keep getting characters introduced and then the focus goes on them because they're the author's new blurbo, and all the focus is on them, and the old characters go in the background, and the reader goes, well, what happened to them? So that tends to be something that can get really, really frustrating for a reader, that I think you, as an author, you really need to keep in mind, for that role plays can be really fun, but maybe not so much when you're a reader.
Yeah, definitely when I was doing those like text form role plays, a lot of it was just like, we thought this would be cool at the time. Like reading over some of those logs, which can take a while because some of them are like hundreds of pages in Microsoft Word, like after I extracted the logs and kind of put them together. And I'd be reading through it and I'd be like, wow, this is the section that we wrote after I like read Full Metal Alchemist or something like that. And like you can kind of see that right there. Whereas if you were adapting it, you want to kind of soften those things or like merge it into a single consistent storyline that doesn't jump around too much and have like themes. So ultimately, I think I agree with Ray that it's often better to just kind of start completely from fresh and don't try to directly adapt the entire thing. I know we didn't really touch on it, but like this probably goes double for anything based on like a tabletop role play, like a D&D kind of thing.
Yeah, I totally agree because I think what something that's like also important to keep in mind that like you said, Thane, that NRP can be like colored so much by the things that you're reading at the time, that you're consuming at the time, or even like the stuff that you're going through at the moment, because sometimes you also RP in a way that like maybe helps you deal with stress or other things that you go through in that moment, and that might make for fun or cathartic or like cool RP, but not really for like an enjoyable story. And I think something that I like keep in mind a lot is that the characters that I RP, like I RP them in different scenarios. And sometimes we don't need like that much setup because we already know the characters. So when we get to like an emotional scene, or of course that scene will be emotional for us because we're already familiar with the characters because we RP'd them for like a long time. So if I would take like any of these scenarios and try to extract them exactly as they are into a story, they would not really land emotionally because the reader doesn't have the familiarity that like we have with the characters that we are appearing with.
Yeah, on some levels, it almost feels like these kinds of RPs, in a way, it's like it's a similar thing to fan fiction, where like you're sort of, I guess it's almost like you're telling fan fiction to each other, kind of about your own characters, like hitting that like little itch in your brain of like being like, I love these characters already and now I want to keep exploring. But a new reader to a comic won't have that bit of context. It's like reading fan fiction for a series that they don't know. So you got to make sure that when you are adapting a role play, that you do lay that groundwork first and really kind of analyze, like, in this storyline, so who are these characters? How can I, like, I guess ideally as concisely as possible, get the reader up to speed with what they need to know, ideally by telling the most compelling part of their story. So an RP, I guess an advantage of it is that it is such a character focused storyline that if when it's nailed, the readers will often kind of fall in love with the characters, and that's awesome to see. But you definitely have to make sure to put in the work of letting the reader know who they are and what their deal is, without it being like, okay, this is backstory dump time. uh, you gotta walk them through like a story. This is kind of where I guess I'm at with those long like text form RPs, where I feel like they really do have to be like stripped down to the bones and rebuilt to turn into a comic. And it is a lot of work, and getting a collaborator on board with that level of work is something that I'm pretty new to and can definitely be a challenge in its own right. And with that, I think that is a roasted red pepper and goat cheese wrap. So thank you for listening to our episode today. I've been your host, Farah, and you can find my comics at chiralt.sevensmith.net and at witchwoodcomic.com.
I've been Finn, and you can find my comic at airsoftheveil.com.
And I've been Ray, and you can find my comic at empyreancomic.com and Overlord of Ravenfell on Webtoon.
Whoo! And see you later, slappers.
Yeah, I'm gonna go back and make my characters kiss the characters of my friends in our piece.
Hell yeah. New comic,
New
just all
comic,
kissing.
just all kissing, yes.
Yeah. Thank
Thank you for listening to Screen Tones, a webcomic podcast. We are supported in part by the fantastic folks at Hiveworks, home of many amazing independent webcomics. Check out their store at hivemill.com to find ebooks and print books of many fine Hiveworks titles. We're also supported by, well, listeners like you over on Ko-fi. Drop us a few bucks if you enjoy what we do and want to help us continue talking about anything and everything webcomics. And don't forget to give us a follow on Blue Sky and Tumblr so you don't miss an episode. You can find links to all of those at screentonescast.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.